Now we're going to talk about the structure of a long bone. All right. So all long bones have this structure in common. So this image is a picture of a long bone, and this specifically is the femur. All right. So surrounding the bone is going to be a connective tissue covering called the periosteum. So peri, think perimeter, osteum around the bone. So surrounding the outside of the bone, firmly adhered to the bone itself, is a connective tissue, again called the periosteum. It's made up of dense, irregular, collagenous connective tissue. So dense, irregular connective tissue with lots of collagen fibers. It's going to be tough and resist pulling forces, but it's also because of the irregular nature of the collagen fibers. It has the room to be highly vascularized. So you'll see lots of blood vessels running through this connective tissue covering, as well as nervous tissue supply. And that's really the function. So the periosteum pretty much surrounds the bone. It's going to create, separate the bone from the other tissues that surround it. And then it also supplies the blood vessels as well as the nervous tissue for the bone itself. The periosteum will also have, on the inside of the periosteum, a layer of bone cells, and we'll learn about what these cells are later in this chapter, but a layer of cells that will actually participate in growth, development, and remodeling of the bone. All right, so those are the functions of the periosteum. It helps, encapsulate, separate and anchor the bone to surrounding tissues. It provides a blood supply as well as a nervous tissue supply, and then it has a layer of bone cells that participate in growth, development, and remodeling of the bone. This structure right here called perforating fibers, so here the periosteum is being peeled away from the bone itself. It's just showing you that the periosteum is the layer that surrounds the bone. And these perforating fibers are collagenous, so collagen fibers that adhere the periosteum to the bone, as well as penetrate deep within the bone to really anchor the periosteum in place, okay? So that's what's called perforating fibers, collagen fibers that anchors the periosteum firmly to the underlying bone. All right, so what is a diaphysis? So if we look at the long bone, remember long bones are longer than they are wide. There's a slender shaft, which is this middle portion, and then we have these enlarged ends, right? So the enlarged ends are called epiphyses, or epiphysis for plural, all right? Epiphyses for plural, epiphysis for singular. And then the shaft of the long bone is called the diaphysis, all right? So diaphysis, epiphyses, all right? The epiphyses will participate in forming joints. So we've referred to, since long bones, remember, are primarily found in the appendicular skeleton of the upper limbs and the lower limbs. Every long bone will have a proximal epiphysis as well as a distal epiphysis. So here, this is the head of the femur that forms the hip joint. Okay, and so this would be the proximal epiphysis, whereas down here, this epiphysis would help form the knee joint. So this is the distal epiphysis, all right? So again, epiphyses are enlarged ends of a long bone that participate in joints, in the formation of a joint. Let's see. In the epiphyses, so this is looking at let's see, this would be, this is a section through the long bone. And we can see housed in the epiphysis is this red tissue. This is red bone marrow. So red bone marrow can be found in the epiphyses, which, remember, red bone marrow has bone-forming cells, or hematopoietic tissue, okay? And in the diaphysis, the diaphysis, if you notice, is carved out, and this carved area is called the medullary cavity. And contained within the medullary cavity is yellow bone marrow. And remember, yellow bone marrow is primarily vascular tissue and adipose. That's why it has this yellow color. So it's an energy storage or a triglyceride storage site. All right. Now, what it means by red, or so the medullary cavity within the diaphysis, all right, so this carved out portion of the shaft is called the medullary cavity, and it says it can contain either red or yellow bone marrow depending on the bone and age of the individual. So children, most of the marrow in the skeleton of a child will be red bone marrow because children are rapidly growing and they require lots of blood cells for the rapidly growing tissues of a child. Over time, as a child ages into an adult, red bone marrow, a lot of the red bone marrow will get replaced with yellow bone marrow. All right, except for within certain bones, and we'll talk about that later. But a lot of the red bone marrow will be replaced with yellow bone marrow. Now, what's cool is this yellow bone marrow can actually convert back to red bone marrow if an adult gets a condition or a disease that requires more blood cells, right? So if they acquire some sort of condition that requires more blood cells, the yellow bone marrow actually can convert back to red bone marrow to help out with blood cell formation. So that's kind of cool. All right, so you should know, what are epiphyses, what is that diaphysis, what's housed in the epiphyses, what's housed in the diaphysis. All right, so structure of long bone continued. Now, if we look here, so here's a longitudinal section through the bone, we can see that the outer portion of the bone looks dense. It is dense. This is compact bone. Whereas on the inside, we can see that it looks spongy, or it has these holes, and that's called spongy bone. So the outer periphery of the bone itself is composed of compact bone. And then in the middle, we see spongy bone. And spongy bone it's very spongy in appearance. It contains lots of little cavities or holes. All right, and we'll talk about why. So compact bone is compact. That's the type of bone that we looked at in chapter 4 when we talked about bone connective tissue. The extracellular matrix is primarily composed of those calcium salts, like calcium phosphate salt. So it aids in this just like a really rigid, hard extracellular matrix. And that makes sense because the outer perimeter of the bone, we want to be able to resist compression and twisting forces. We want it to be compact and hard to resist stresses that the skeleton will encounter, right? So the dense outer region is compact bone, whereas the inside of a bone will be made up of spongy bone. Another term for spongy bone is also cancellous. And it has this honeycomb-like framework of bony struts. And so the function of spongy bone, there are a couple of functions of spongy bone. One, it does help because it still consists of a hard extracellular matrix, but it's just structured differently than compact bone. And we'll talk about the microscopic structure of compact bone a little bit later in this chapter. But having these struts oriented in all different directions allows long bones to resist forces in many directions. You can see that it's very porous and there are lots of little cavities. These little cavities can house and protect bone marrow, whether it is red bone marrow or yellow bone marrow. All right, so it helps house and protect red bone or bone marrow. And then another function of spongy bone is it helps reduce the weight of the skeleton. So if all of our bones were just compact bone throughout, right? This whole thing, this whole bone, every single bone in your body was just solid compact bone, we would be really heavy. So having this spongy, porous bone, right, in the middle helps reduce the weight of the overall skeleton as well. All right, now there's another layer of connective tissue. We talked about the periosteum, which surrounds the entire bone. It's directly adhered to the outside of the bone. Well, on the inside, so we can see, look, the diaphysis has this carved out medullary cavity. Lining the inside of this medullary cavity is a very thin layer of connective tissue called the endosteum, all right, the endosteum. Now, lining all of these bony struts of this spongy bone would also be a thin layer of connective tissue, a thin connective tissue membrane called endosteum as well. Right? So the endosteum is a thin connective tissue membrane that lines the inside of a bone, both the medullary cavity as well as the spongy bone. Function of the endosteum, it also provides cells that will participate, and we'll talk about this later, but the endosteum provides cells that will participate in the growth, development, and the remodeling of bone as well. And that's what different populations of cells involved in the maintenance of bone homeostasis. All right, so that's the growth, development, as well as remodeling that occurs throughout the lifetime of a human. Another structure to talk about are the epiphyseal lines or the epiphyseal plates. So if we look, so epiphyseal line, that gives you an idea that it's going to be located near the epiphyses or those enlarged ends of the long bone. And here we see epiphyseal lines right here, okay? And then down here, this is also an epiphyseal line. Now, I'm calling these epiphyseal lines because they're completely ossified. So this would be from a femur of a fully grown adult. You're not getting any taller, so these epiphyseal lines are completely ossified. But under the age of like 25, these epiphyseal lines would actually be made up of hyaline cartilage. And that would be called, so in younger individuals where these epiphyseal lines are still made up of hyaline cartilage and not ossified tissue, then it's given the name epiphyseal plate or growth plates. Because at these epiphyseal plates, when hyaline cartilage is present, then these bones can grow in length. And we'll talk about how bones grow in length at the epiphyseal plates later on in the chapter. All right, so in younger growing humans, these would be made up of hyaline cartilage and they would be called epiphyseal plates or growth plates. It allows for lengthening of bones. Now, in an older adult that is no longer growing, this hyaline cartilage is replaced with ossified tissue, hard ossified tissue, and they are now called epiphyseal lines because they're completely ossified. Okay. Let's see, did I miss anything? Boop, boop, boop. Let's see. Okay, I think I got everything for the structure of a long bone. All right. Now, the structure of short bones, flat bones, irregular bones, and sesamoid bones. Now, they aren't long bones, so we don't see a diaphysis, we don't see epiphyses, all right? We won't see those structures in short, flat, irregular, or sesamoid bones, but they do share some common, so they don't have diaphyses or epiphyses. Because they don't have a diaphysis, they're not going to contain medullary cavities, because remember, medullary cavities are the carved out cavity within the diaphysis, but they don't have diaphyses, so they won't have a medullary cavity. Because they don't have epiphyses, those enlarged ends, we won't see epiphyseal lines or epiphyseal plates. They have different ways of growing, okay? But they do share some common features. So for example, so here is a piece of the cranium. So this is one of the bones that makes up the cranium. And we can see that there's still a periosteum. And remember, a periosteum is dense, irregular, collagenous connective tissue. It encapsulates the bone. It separates but also anchors the bone to tissues that surround it. It's going to contain a blood supply. So this is how blood vessels innervate and get to the bone itself. It provides blood vessels, it provides a nervous tissue supply, as well as those cells that will participate in the growth, development, and remodeling of bone. And then it still has those perforating fibers, remember those collagen fibers that help anchor the periosteum to the bone tissue itself. All right, so those structures are similar. And then the internal structure, we can see it looks kind of like a sandwich. We still see compact bone on the outside and spongy bone on the inside. So that still holds true like we see here in the long bones, right? So compact bone around the periphery on the edges, and then sandwiched in between the two layers of compact bone is our spongy bone. And remember, spongy bone, same thing we talked about before. It looks spongy in structure. It makes all these little cavities. Those cavities can house and protect red bone marrow, as well as reduce the weight of the overall skeleton, especially the head. So if our skull was too heavy, our brain weighs a lot. And then if our bones were super heavy, like compact bone all the way through, our head would be really, really heavy. It would be difficult to keep upright. Okay. Let's see. Oh, so the spongy bone, so this is some kind of like terminology, but the spongy bone in these short, flat, irregular, and sesamoid bones, it's given a special name called diploe. So if you ever see or read the term, I don't usually ask this on the test, but if you ever read this term diploe, this is referring to the spongy bone that's sandwiched in between two layers of compact bone in short, flat, irregular, or sesamoid bones. All right, so blood supply and nerve supply to the bone. Remember, bone is actually very well vascularized, and so bones will heal faster than, say, cartilage. I talked about that in chapter 4 in a little bit of a detail. But bones are actually very well vascularized. Even though they are very hard and have a rigid extracellular matrix, they have lots of a very rich blood supply. So blood supply to short, flat, irregular, and sesamoid bones are mostly provided by the blood vessels of the periosteum, and those blood vessels will penetrate through the bone, and the holes that they penetrate through are called, if you ever see the term foramen is a hole in bones where blood vessels as well as nerves can enter and exit the bone. Okay, so if you ever hear the term foramen, it's a hole in bones where blood vessels and nerves can enter and exit. Let's see. Long bones get a third of their blood supply from the periosteum, which mostly supplies the compact bone that's around the periphery, right? So long bones get blood supply from the periosteum. And then as well as, so those blood vessels from the periosteum will enter in through those foramen, which I just mentioned, that you can call them nutrient foramen. And those arteries or those blood vessels will enter in through those foramen and actually enter into the compact bone itself. Let's see. Okay, so just, for our purposes, know that the periosteum provides blood supply and a nervous tissue supply. And then blood vessels are allowed to enter and exit the bones through these nutrient foramen, all right? And then we'll talk about how those blood vessels then split off and penetrate all throughout the bone later on in the histology section. Remember, red bone marrow is a specialized type of connective tissue. It contains hematopoietic cells. Hematopoiesis is the formation of blood cells. I already mentioned this, but the amount of red bone marrow decreases with age, and a lot of it will be replaced because as we grow, as we age, we're not really rapidly growing anymore like children do. So our need for a lot of bones or a lot of blood cells decreases. And so the red bone marrow will be replaced with yellow bone marrow over time. And then red bone marrow in an adult is really only found in the pelvis, proximal femur, and proximal humerus. So when we say proximal, I'm talking about the epiphyses, the proximal epiphysis of the femur, as well as the proximal epiphysis of the humerus, within the vertebrae, ribs, sternum, and clavicles. Oh, and scapulae, some bones of the skull. All right, so red bone marrow will be limited to these bones. A lot of the medullary cavities, which are found in the diaphysis of long bones, that red bone marrow, as we age, gets replaced with the yellow bone marrow. Okay. So children, again, will have more red bone marrow because they are growing rapidly and developing rapidly, and they require more blood cells for that development. And again, yellow bone marrow in adults primarily found in the medullary cavity contained within the diaphysis. Yellow bone marrow is primarily blood vessels and adipocytes. Those adipocytes store triglycerides, so yellow bone marrow functions in triglyceride and therefore energy storage. And then if you want to read through this on your own, I won't ask this on the test, but this just talks about bone marrow transplantation. With certain diseases, individuals may require a bone marrow transplant so that they can have adequate and normal blood cell formation, right? And it just talks about, the book gives a little blurb on how bone marrow transplantation takes place.